the left there's a light that glows by the front door. Don't forget that key's under the mat. Men start riding, rode it one time, go rolling round. Allemande left and weave the rain. Go to church cause your mama says to. Visit grandpa each chance that you can. Let yourself feel the pride. Always stay humble and kind.
All right, here we go. Another Square Dance Callers Talking. Tonight, I'm going back to Canada. I have Barry Clasper on the podcast tonight. Mr. Clasper, how are you?
I'm great. You say you're going back to Canada. Who did you come to Canada for before?
Well, you've put me on the spot. I'm the first one. I'll remember in just a minute. I know I've talked to some people in Canada before because we were speaking earlier. My grandmother's actually from Newfoundland, Canada, and so I've got a little bit of a Canadian root there. Not very much, but just that. So, what part of Canada are you in, sir?
I'm in Toronto, Ontario. So
Okay.
It's just on Lake Ontario.
Okay.
A lot of people think that's on the coast, but it's actually about 1,000 miles from the coast.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You got a 2 to 3 day drive to get there, to get to the coast from here.
Now, were you born and raised in that area, or just always from Canada?
Well, I'm always from Canada, but I was born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
for those of you who are not familiar with Canadian geography, Winnipeg, Manitoba is actually pretty close to being the geographic center of the continent.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it's about 400 miles north of Minneapolis. So that should position it for a lot of people.
Okay. I got you.
So it's out in the prairies, everything's flat, cold in the winter,
Sure.
great northern lights.
I've always wanted to see the Northern Lights. Maybe someday, at some point, I can get up there and see that. That'd be nice.
Yeah, it's one of those things that seeing pictures of it doesn't do it justice.
I'm sure.
So it's definitely worth a trip of some kind. The trouble is you can't know when they're going to happen.
Sure. Yeah.
It takes certain atmospheric conditions and sun activity conditions before you get them.
Okay. So Canadian, very nice. We're on here about square dancing. So when did you start square dancing itself?
Well, I started square dancing in 1973.
Okay.
But my parents had square danced for years and years before that. I'm not exactly sure when they started. It would have been in the early 50s sometime. So I'd always been aware of it. And there was a period in my teens when they were unwise enough to try and get me to do it. They sent me off to a square dance class at the local community center.
Mm-hmm.
I was in those teen years when nothing your parents do is cool.
Sure.
So I didn't want anything to do with it. So I eventually they threw up their hands and I dropped out. But I'd seen, square dancing was a big part of their recreational life. So I'd seen a lot of it. They had dances down their basement. So there were nights I remember when we were in one of these 2.5-story post-war houses, and my bedroom's up under the eaves of the attic sort of thing, and they were down in the basement. So there were a couple of floors below me, and the noise would just would keep me awake, and it bugged me at the time. But I mean, the noise was people laughing and really having a great time. So that was the image I had of it. A lot of people partying.
Nice. Okay.
The image I had of square dancing, which wasn't enough to get me into it as a teenager, because my parents partying doesn't mean I want to party with them.
I agree.
So I went through my whole adolescence without ever actually learning it myself, but I had a pretty good idea what it was all about and the kind of the social life and community that goes around it. So then I moved out. I was I went to school on an Army program that paid for my tuition. Okay. So when I got out, I owed the Army 3 years of my life, and they posted me out to Ottawa. there's a story about how I got there, but I'm not going to go into that right now.
That's fine.
So when I was in Ottawa, I was working for the government and as a military person, and they trained me in this data processing thing, which in 1968, when I was talking about when I was doing all this, was one of those things that was obvious. It was the coming thing. People were really scrambling for anybody that had any experience in it. And the Army trained me in data processing, trained me as a programmer, systems analyst, and all that. And I spent 3 years doing that work for them. So my time in the military was all sitting at a computer. Keyboard.
Okay.
And at the end of my 3 years, now during those 3 years, they owned me, right? I owed them 3 years of my life. They could have posted me anywhere they wanted. They could have put me in any kind of trade that they wanted, but they had trained me in this upcoming lucrative profession. And at the end of the 3 years, they decided, now we're going to post you to some radar station in Blackfly country in Northern Ontario. And you, by the way, you can't take your wife. And by then I had, we had a baby. And I thought, I really don't want to do that. So I looked into joining the civil service instead. And I found out that I could take off my uniform, sit at the same desk, doing exactly the same job, and make 25% more, which in those days was only $2,000. But that gives you an idea what the salaries were like in those days. So that, I took a couple of nanoseconds to think that over and took the job. I worked for that was in 1971. And I took that promotion, and about 2 years later, year and a half later, I got an opportunity to apply for a job opening a new data center as the head of the system software section in this data center. And I got that job. So we found ourselves moving to an Army base. Now, while I was actually in the Army, I'd never had an opportunity to live on base where it's cheap. But now that I'm a civilian, I got a chance to actually live in senior officers' quarters on base, because the way the Army worked was when they had civilians and Army people working in the same jobs, they to make their lives simpler, they equated the civilian positions to Army ranks.
Okay.
So I was going into this new job as a major, which was considered senior officers level. So I got to go into the biggest house we have ever had, this house on the base. And we moved. When we first went there, we thought, well, we'll take this house on the base, but we'll scout around for places in the nearby towns, and we'll buy a house there. And after we'd lived on the base, we moved there in January of 1973. And when we moved in, it was really cold, and it had been snowy, and and we thought this is not going to be fun. But by the time spring came along, we were just in love with living on the base, because everything you could want was on that base. There were grocery stores, there were barbershops, there were clubs. There were so many clubs. I think at one point I was writing an article for the newsletter, base newsletter, and I counted them up, and there were 74 different clubs on the base, like clubs that were recreational type things. So there was an archery club. There were 2 golf courses, which were sought after as really good courses to play on. There were 2 curling clubs. And in fact, it was 2 of a lot of things, because the base was a training base during the war, and it had an Air Force side and an Army side. And so even though they were on the same geography, they tended to, treat each other as separate entities. So they had all their own amenities for their own people. And then later on, when they merged the 2 bases together, they had 2 of everything.
Okay.
And so one of the clubs, to make a long story long, one of the clubs was a square dance club. And my buddy and I at the at the data center had gotten to know one another really, really well and became friends because basically I was the software guy, he was the hardware guy, and we'd gone in and set this data center up. So we considered it to be our data center. You know, there were managers higher than us, but we thought he was the IBM customer engineer on the site, and I was the head of the software section in the data center. So one day, we socialized with him a lot. And one day, Ray's wife actually was reading an article in this newsletter that I was telling you about that the Square Dance Club, was inviting people to come and watch them. Now this was in the spring, so Ray talked us into going with them and seeing what this was all about. And I had these vestigial memories of what square dancing was all about from my childhood,
right?
And so by now I had matured to the point where I thought, well, maybe this would be a good thing to try. And also our lives, Pam and I, our lives had gotten to the stage where, we had a young daughter and we had a son on the way by then. And we'd gotten into these activities on the base, and we were finding that, we were sort of taking shifts where one of us would go out to one of these activities, and the other one would be babysitting, and then the one who was out would come back and the other one would go out somewhere, and it was like we hardly ever see one another. We're always out somewhere and the other one's babysitting. So we were kind of looking for something we could do together, and hire babysitters. So anyway, we went to this square dance, and thought, boy, this really looks like fun. But it turned out that the Square Dance Club had messed up, because this article that they had in the newsletter was supposed to be something for the fall when their beginners class started.
Mm-hmm. And
in fact, what we went to was the last dance of their dance season. They shut down for the summer.
Oh, okay.
But we were hooked enough that we went back in the fall. And by then, our son was really close to being delivered. He was born on September 11th, which came later to be a date that people sort of open their eyes when they hear that.
Sure.
And my parents had made arrangements that they were going to come and stay with us around the time that Ken was due to be born. And boy, they managed to time it so that they arrived. We got Ken. My wife delivered really quickly, even for our daughter who came 3 years earlier. She was only in labor with him for like 90 minutes or something. And so we were concerned. The hospital that Ken was going to be, she was going to have Ken, was a half-hour drive away. Oh. And we thought, well, the first one came in 90 minutes, and usually the rest come quicker than that. So we were somewhat concerned.
Yeah.
So we sort of had an escape plan all worked out, and we were going to leave Andrea with Ray and Marilyn, the friends that had investigated square dancing with us, because they lived in Alliston, or not in Alliston, in Angus, which was just on the way into where the hospital was at Barry. So we thought that means we can sort of drive by Angus really quick, and we can drop Andrea off. Andrea is our daughter, with Ray and Marilyn, and then continue on into the hospital. That was our plan. So one night, Pam goes into labor, we thought. We executed our plan, beetled into the hospital, and I dropped her off, and everything stopped. And it was like, great. But they kept her around because she had this history, so they weren't really sure that they wanted to let her go back. So they kept her for that day, and then they just said, well, if nothing's going on, we'll discharge you the next morning. And so the threat of discharging her, I guess, triggered something, because about 4 o'clock in the morning, the next morning, she delivered Ken, and she delivered him at 45 minutes. So it was a good thing that she was already there. And my parents contrived to arrive that day.
Okay.
So they showed up from Winnipeg. Now, Winnipeg from Camp Borden from Winnipeg is another 3-day drive, 2.5 to 3 days, depending on how long you were prepared to drive in a day. It's three 400-mile days. Let's put it that way. So they managed to arrive just the day that Pam delivered. So they were around to help take care of Andrea while Pam was in the hospital and I was still working. And then when Pam got out of the hospital, she got out of the hospital, and then I think it was 2 days later, the club met on Mondays. The first square dance beginners class started just after she got out of the hospital. And she didn't feel ready to do something that involved a lot of walking and whatnot at that time. So I went with my parents. They came to the dance with me, and I danced with my mother for the beginners class. And so Pam didn't start until the following week. So I like telling people that I'm the senior dancer in the group. That was 1973. So we've been dancing now for over 50 years. It was 50 years last year. So yeah, it's been a journey.
Sure. That's a great story on how that started. Oh my gosh. But so you were exposed to it and with your parents as you were growing up, and then you kind of got brought back into it, which is nice, in the military. And so did your wife take to it immediately too? She wasn't raised around it, was she?
No, she wasn't. She'd never seen it. But we both took to it right away. Like, we really enjoyed everything about it. We enjoyed we were relatively young. We were in our mid-20s when we started. Boy, I wish we could get more people in their mid-20s starting these days.
Oh yeah, I know. I understand that completely.
And most of the people that were with us in our class were similar age, mid-20s to early 30s kind of thing. And we had, not sure exactly how big that beginners class was, but it was something on the order of 3-4 squares, maybe. That was standard in those days, that you get classes that were that big. And turned out we had a great caller. We didn't know it at the time, a guy named Al Calhoun, who was ex-military.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of these guys that he knew how to make it fun, but at the same time, he knew how to get you through your paces. So he taught us how the calls worked. And he taught us all the fundamentals so that they were really just baked into our brains. And thinking back on it, there was a lot of drill, military guy. But at the same time, the way he did it, it was fun. So, I mean, we were laughing from day one, and, we thought, man, this is great. And by the time we graduated into the club, in those days, there was class and club. And that was it. That, the whole idea of the levels and whatnot was just, we didn't know it at the time, but by the time we were learning, Collar Lab, the people who formed Collar Lab were just starting to talk about trying to provide some kind of rigorous structure to the dance activity, because they could see that it was becoming more and more popular, and it was starting to, there were elements that were starting to go in different directions. And so they thought, if we want this to really become a big activity, we have to get some organization behind it.
Sure.
So that dancers can dance in more than one place, and you don't have to know your caller intimately to be able to dance to him. But we didn't know any of that at the time that we were learning. We just knew Al was a great caller. Yeah. And in the area that we were, so Camp Borden is about 60 miles north of Toronto. And it's a little city on its own. At the time we were there was about 10,000 people living and working on the base. So, I mean, that's a fair-sized town in a lot of places. It was bigger than some of the surrounding towns that people lived in. But even in that kind of an area, which was kind of semi-rural, there was a lot of farms in the area. There was still a lot of square dance clubs. So there was about half a dozen callers in the surrounding areas, all of them with clubs that met on multiple nights. So there was just all kinds of dancing available. And by the time we graduated into the club, so that was kind of the following spring, like a year after the initial meeting we'd gone to, which turned out to be their end meeting for the previous year. We were really hooked. So we started looking for all the dances that we could get in our area during the summer. And during the summer, even though the clubs folded up, they tended to have various special events.
Okay.
And in fact, our own club, called the Borden Square Timers, had a regular thing they did in June called the Strawberry Festival, I think they called it. And so it was after the strawberries came into season, and they would buy like gazillions of strawberries, and they'd spend hours and hours shucking them and, getting ready, and they'd make strawberry shortcake and all this stuff. And they'd have this big dance. And, it wasn't a weekend where, a suite of traveling callers came in or anything like that. It was just our caller, Al. And people would come from all over the place to come to this. They get 20, 25 squares at this thing. Easy, like pack it, Jim. Absolutely pack it. Because strawberry shortcake, like what's not to love? And for us, that was our introduction to square dancing, was that kind of thing. In fact, those kinds of dinners, whenever they had a potluck, it was just a thing of magnificence, because even though we were on the base, all around us, surrounding us, was farm country. So a lot of the people that were in the club were military people or civilian employees like me, and had a connection to the base. But a lot of members were also from the surrounding farms. So when they had a potluck, all these farm wives would cook. Man, could they cook. And the pies and stuff that they would make. I mean, these potlucks were just, we still remember those. They were just such a great time. So anyway, that was our introductory experience. So it's little wonder that we really got hooked on this. And we started going around during the summer to whatever special dances we could find that were like our Strawberry Festival. And each club tended to have at least one thing they did during the summer. So you could easily, go to at least a dance a weekend somewhere within an hour's drive. Definitely by the time we'd gone through that summer, this was now our main avocation. We started to organize our lives around square dancing.
Sure, I know that feeling.
And it's been that way ever since. I mean, now that I'm retired, I mean, this is what we do. We're heavily invested in the whole square dance activity. I mean, we work for Color Lab, we work for the IHSDC. I call dances, and Pam organizes all kinds of stuff. And this is what we do in our retirement. And I'm really glad that in fact, I retired early from IBM because it was getting in the way of the square dance stuff.
Okay.
I was having to manage my vacation time too much and whatnot. So I took early retirement.
Very nice. Gosh. So you would work at IBM before retiring?
Yeah, I spent not quite 10 years, like 9 years and 6 months or something like that, working at the data processing job with the Department of National Defense, both as a military and a civilian employee.
Okay.
And what had happened was the guy who ran the data center, who I reported to, went out on sick leave. He got cancer and was out on sick leave for an extended sick leave while he was under treatment. Mm-hmm. And they made me acting superintendent, they called him, it sounds like it's a grand sounding name, but to me, it sounded like, somebody who manages an apartment or an apartment building and, does all the custodial work and whatnot. That was what the name applied to me. But that was the guy that ran the data center was called the superintendent. So I was acting superintendent. Now, when I was head of the software section, I was basically a working team leader. Right, I had a couple of guys working for me, and so I was a manager in the sense that I had the right to performance reviews and that kind of thing. But basically, we were a little team that did everything together, and I did it with them. So when I stepped into this superintendent job, now I'm in a real management position, or at least as real as management positions in the government get.
Yeah.
And it didn't take me long to realize I hate this. This is not my thing. And I did it for, I don't know, 8-9 months, I guess. And I finally said to the powers that be, I want out. I'll go back to my old job. I don't want to do this anymore. So there was a military guy that was running the administration section. So they could just post him into the job and there's nothing he could say about it. So they posted him into the job and he became the acting superintendent. And I went back to my software section. And that was sort of a weird thing in its own right, because he had worked for me in the software section. And then he got promoted into becoming the head of the administration section. So he was my peer in the hierarchy. And then I became the acting superintendent. So he was working for me again. And then when we did this reversal, he became the acting superintendent and I went back to the software job and I was working for him. Fortunately, we got along great. So none of that was a real problem, except he didn't want to be the acting superintendent either. But I realized at that point that if I wanted to get promoted in the government, the only way I could do that was to get into management. And I just discovered I hate management. So I started looking for a job where I could work as a technical person, at least for a substantial part of my career, and expect, some kind of progression. I wasn't going to be stuck in one particular kind of job. And in those days, so now we're talking 1977, anybody with data processing experience, if you were, and I had, I'd been a systems programmer, I'd been an IMS systems programmer, I knew how to do sysgens, I knew the insides of the operating systems, the big iron, as we called it. And so I was in hot demand. There's just no question. I had 7 job offers, within 2 weeks of starting to look. And one of them was with IBM. So my friend Ray, who I'd, gotten into square dancing with, worked for IBM, and he put my name forward in some places in Toronto. And so I got an interview with them. And IBM came in like way below any of the other offers that I had. They were by far at the bottom of the pile when it came to money. But all the other offers were either just at the top of the technical ladder, so that if you wanted to go anywhere beyond that job, now bear in mind, I'm 31 at this point. If I wanted anything beyond that job, I was into management. And a couple of them were already, management. In fact, one of them was a vice president of operations. And I thought, the jobs looked appealing. They paid a lot of money, but I thought, I know I'm going to hate it. So I'd sort of made up my mind, okay, we're going to take this low ball offer from IBM because it's the only company that had a technical track and a management track. So you could go into the technical track and you couldn't go right to the top of the company. You're never going to be chairman of the board or anything. But you could certainly go a long way up a nice defined ladder that could easily last your career. You could have a very fulfilling career and stay technical, doing technical work the whole time. So I thought, that's what I've been looking for. So that's what I'm going to sign up for. And I'd sort of resigned myself to doing it. And literally, that was sort of over an evening, Pam and I talking it over, and made up my mind, okay, we're going to do this. The next day at work, I get a phone call from one of the headhunters that I talked to for an outfit called ICBC in Vancouver. So long way from Toronto. And ICBC is ICBC was the insurance company of British Columbia. So it's a government insurance company that does all their auto insurance and that kind of stuff. And I'd had an interview with their headhunter in Toronto and hadn't heard back from them for, several weeks at this point. So I just say, well, they weren't interested, and wrote it off. So I get this phone call from this headhunter, and he says, they would like to interview you in Vancouver. And being a good little doobie, I confessed to him that, well, I'm sorry, I made up my mind that I've got an offer from IBM and I'm going with them. And he said, well, have you actually signed anything or given them a commitment that you're going with them? And I said, well, no, not yet. We just made the decision last night. And he said, well, let us fly you out and, talk to us, and maybe you'll be interested. And I said, I don't know. I knew that was one of the jobs that was already in management. So I wasn't keen going into it. And so I demurred a little bit, and he said, let them talk to you. What's the worst that can happen? So I said, okay, as long as they understand. So they flew me out to Vancouver. So they flew me out on a Friday, and they wanted a couple of days of interviews, so couldn't do them all on the Friday. Didn't get there until noonish on the Friday. So we did some interviews on Friday. They paid for my stay in a hotel over the weekend. And I had friends in Vancouver, so visited my friends, and they took me sailing, and I had a great weekend in Vancouver. Did the rest of the interviews on Monday, and confirmed my opinion that I was going to hate this job and there was no way that I was going to take it. So I flew back, and I landed in Toronto. Borden is 60 miles north of Toronto, so I'd have to drive up there. The car was in the parking lot at Pearson Airport. Wasn't Pearson in those days, but so I thought, well, I better call Pam and let her know that I've landed, but I'm thinking, I've just confirmed that I really want to go with IBM. So since I'm already down here in the city, I'll call the guy that I was talking to and see if I can get a quick appointment to go in and talk to him in his office, in the IBM offices in Toronto. So I call Pam, and she says, well, that's interesting, because IBM called while you were gone. And I just told them you were away, and didn't tell them any more than that, just told them that you were away. So when I called the IBM guy from the airport, he said, well, as it happens, if you're at the airport, I live not too far from the airport, so why don't you come home, you meet me at this address, and we'll talk there. And so we talked at his home, and suddenly the offer had sweetened by 20%. So it was still way low. It was still the lowball offer of all the ones that I'd gotten, but it was 20% better than it had been.
Wow.
And that was just based on the fact that Pam had been very circumspect about what she'd said to him, and obviously put the wind up that if they wanted me, they were going to have to sweeten the deal a little bit.
Right.
And that's how I got started with IBM. So I was with them for 30 years.
Okay.
And had a great career. I don't regret it for a moment going with them. Did a lot of work with large systems. Eventually got into large systems printers. Became one of the authorities on printers. Country support in Canada, and had a lot of interaction with the development groups for the software that drives the large printers. I called them young printing presses, because they were really fast laser printers that now are, you've all seen output from these things. They do all your bills and and that sort of thing. And then from there I got into I got into software, the IBM software division, doing knowledge management kind of stuff and solution assurance. And I eventually retired after 30 years out of that kind of a job. And I retired, and I said I retired because it was getting in the way of my square dancing. And that really isn't just a facetious,
Sure.
it really was.
Like, yes,
and the way their pension plan worked is the pension maxed out after 30 years. Right. IBM has a non-contributory pension plan. So company contributes to it, but you don't. So it means that the pension itself is smaller than it might have been. But you've got money left over out of your salary that you can invest yourself. That was kind of their rationale behind it all. And so their contributions maxed out at 30 years. And so the only way that your pension would go up after that is if you got promoted and your salary went up. And after 30 years, I knew that was liable to happen. I was sort of at the top of where I was going. So as soon as I had my 30 years after the golden handcuffs came off, I retired and got into square dance calling full time.
Very nice. Going back to that, when did you started dancing? How long after you started dancing did you start or decide you wanted to start trying to call?
I'm not sure I decided I wanted to try and call. It was 11 years was the first when I started calling, from the time I started dancing. So we started dancing in 73. I started calling in 84. The main reason I say I'm not, I don't remember exactly starting to call, but I started calling challenge. That was where I started calling. So everything I did was written. And I had cards that were dated 1984. So I knew, okay, I was calling at least by then. But I don't think it was calling. If I was calling before that, it wasn't, too much before, a few months maybe at the outside.
Now, besides the guy, go ahead.
So I forget where I was going with that. Go ahead, ask your question.
But besides the guy that brought you into square dancing, that was very entertaining and kept y'all engaged and all that, do you have any influences as far as your calling? You started out at C, which is reading, but did you have anybody that started talking to you about pattern and stuff like that?
No. When I first started, and like I said, I remember now where I was going. I didn't decide that I wanted to call. But you don't dance for 11 years and watch the guys up on the stage without sort of thinking to yourself, gee, it'd be neat if I could do that. Look what they're doing. Isn't that cool? But I never imagined, in my wildest dreams, that I could do any of that stuff. Certainly the singing part of it, the idea of singing in public was, I couldn't imagine myself doing that. But then, as I said, in 77, when I joined IBM, as a what they call a systems engineer. So I was technical support to the sales team. So the idea was that the salesman went in and sold something that was impossible, and the technical guy would come in and make it work anyway. But we also had to do technical presentations. So when you're trying to convince a customer that you have the best technical solution for whatever their issue is, you need to be able to go in and talk to them.
Right.
And as a result of that, I now had some experience with public speaking, which sort of got me past one of my hurdles in whether I'd ever be able to call. Because now I stood up in front of people, sometimes large audiences. I'd sometimes be giving a technical talk to an audience of 100, 200 people in an auditorium. So that got me past the idea that I could never stand up on that stage all by myself and do something. but the singing thing was still, that was still no way. And one of my favorite stories is because we'd started Dancing Challenge, we danced what would have been plus. At the time it wasn't called that, but it would have been plus. And so we'd gone to a lot of conventions, Dancing Plus, and I'd seen the guys that were doing that kind of stuff with the singing calls and the entertainment callers, and that's what I thought a caller should be. But then when we moved to Toronto in '77, about a year after that, we took some advanced and found we really liked advanced. And then we had an opportunity to learn some C1, so we got into C1. And not long before I started to call, we were dancing a solid C3 at that point, or a good C, maybe it was a good C2. The dates get fuzzy. And so we've been to a lot of challenge dances by then, and I started seeing that there were different kinds of callers. There was callers who didn't do singing calls, and there were callers who read everything and didn't just stand up there on the stage and apparently everything comes out of their head and they don't have any notes and they don't know don't have to read anything, and I thought that was just magic. There's no way I'd ever be able to do that. So we were at one of these big conventions, it went all the way up to C1, but it had mainstream and plus and in advanced. And we're looking, and we got to be, because we were challenge dancers, the challenge dancing community is a lot smaller than the general dance community. And the calling community for a challenge is a lot smaller. So the dancers get to know the callers on a personal basis. You wind up going to dinner with them, and they're not this person up there in the stage, who's separated from you. You get to know them as people. So we had gotten to know Lee Cotton as he came through our neighborhood quite a bit, did a couple or 3 weekends a year for us, and so he knew who we were, and Pam and I are standing up in the mezzanine at this big convention that overlooked a huge gym, like it was like 3 basketball courts strung out kind of thing. And that was the plus hall. That was the big hall. And this was the days when everybody dressed in square dance rig. And when they did a singing call, the whole floor moved together. It was just a thing of beauty to watch. All these squares, it was, like watching the demonstration dancers from an overhead camera looking at this mezzanine overlooking the floor. So Pam and I are leaning up against the rail. Kip Garvey is singing, and he's got them hanging from the chandeliers. Not that there were chandeliers in the gym, but the room is just screaming. And Lee Cotman walks up behind us and sort of butts in between us, shoulders his way in between us. And he puts an arm around each one of us, and he sort of listens to Kip for a couple of minutes. And he says, if I could sing like that, I could go all the way. Then he just turned around and walked away.
Oh my gosh, that's good.
This is, one of the most famous callers in the world. And but anyway, Kip Garvey on that stage, that was what I thought a caller was. And I thought it'd be nice. I'd love to be that guy down there, but I don't see how I can get there. And even after I got over the problem of being able to stand in front of people and say things, I still didn't really think I could be a caller.
Okay.
But the more we got into challenge dancing, the more I started thinking, this is something that maybe I could do. I kind of oozed into it. First of all, you can write all your choreography, so you don't have to try and keep all this stuff in your head. And I'd absorbed a lot of choreography without even realizing it during my years as a plus and advanced dancer and a challenge dancer, like I knew how the calls worked just from doing it so much. So I could write choreography right from day one. I never had a problem with that. I mean, sometimes it took me a while to figure out how to resolve the damn thing, but I'm sitting at my breakfast table with a card, pushing checkers. So it might have taken me an hour to write a card, but I could write the damn thing and eventually resolve the dancers. And so I started. We were in we had a C2 tape group, and one of the people learning C2 with us was one of the local callers, a guy named Leo Descharnes. Okay. So he was trying to get into, he wanted to be able to call C2 as well as dance it. And I said, well, if you like, I'll, write a few sequences for you that you could then call to the group, and I'd enjoy writing the sequences and you'd enjoy calling them and practicing them. And so we did that a little bit. I wrote some choreography for him and he'd call it. Some of it worked and some of it didn't. And although we discovered that sometimes when it didn't, it was because Leo misread it, not because the sequence itself didn't work. And Leo was an amazing guy because he worked as an insurance broker, and he was one of these guys that can sort of do anything he sets his hand to. So he'd done upholstery, he'd worked as a mechanic, he was a square dance caller, and he worked as an insurance broker. And yet he had a severe reading disability, which we didn't know about at the time. And we found out, we said, how the hell can you work as an insurance broker if you've got a reading disability? But what it meant was that when he did read something, he could memorize just like that. So he would take one of my sequences and he would read it. And once he'd read it through once, he had it. But if he misread it, he had it in his head forever. That was the sequence for him. And it took me a while before I realized this, because of course, having a reading disability isn't something that you want to announce to the world. Right. So when we figured out that was what was going on, we could be a little more careful about what he was reading. But he was one of my major influences actually as a caller, because he was the guy that taught me my C1. And we kind of learned C2 together, and we started working on C3 together. He eventually dropped out of that. And unfortunately, he died, too young, as he was a lifelong smoker, and it caught up with him. Sure. But he was a great caller. So he was one of these people that he could do it, but he couldn't explain it very well. So I learned a lot from him just by watching him. And when he explained something to me, I didn't get it. Now, sometimes that's just because you're not ready to hear it. Yeah, you know what that's like as a new caller, right? You get all this sage advice from people, and it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Why are you telling me this? Because you haven't developed to the point where you can see what they're getting at. But I could certainly watch what he did and try and emulate what he did. And he gave me lots of opportunities once I did start to call for his groups. So he was a major influence that way, and giving me the opportunity to call in front of people. And I found that the challenge caller community in general was really generous with anybody that they thought had the potential to become a decent caller. They would answer any question you had. They would help you out often, as I said, before you were ready to hear the help. But this same, another story about Lee Cotman. Okay. The first time I got to call at this local convention that I was telling you about, that Kip Garvey had been calling at, so a couple or 3 years later, I got a guest calling slot there in the C1 hall. And Lee was on staff again. And so got all my material, prepared, and I've tried it out on my dancers, and I'm really ready. But I mean, this is my first time calling to a big floor,
Right.
and I mean, this is our local convention. In those days, 3,500 dancers was the local convention. I mean, the numbers are just, you can't believe today, looking back, that we had crowds like that. So the C1 hall was probably, I don't know, 10, 15 squares, something like that. And I'm up there on a stage, and I called what is still probably one of the best hours I've ever called. I called all of this material for an hour, and it just went seamlessly. I didn't make one single reading mistake. And usually, because I didn't sight call then, if I made a reading mistake, it was square your set. We'll try it again, And about halfway through this, Lee Cotman comes in because he's following me into the room. And he squares up right in front of me for the last couple of tips. And I'm like, oh God, Lee Cotman's down there. Even though I knew him pretty well by this point, still, I mean, this is calling God down there, dancing to me. And like I said, I did this absolutely perfect hour. I couldn't believe it. And so, of course, as soon as I'm finished, I gather up my stuff and I get the hell off the stage because Lee is following me up. And the last thing I want to do is hold him up. So I get down and I'm kind of sitting in a chair decompressing while Lee gets himself set up on the stage. And as soon as he's got the mic in his hand, he says, well, I can only say one thing. Thank God he lives in Canada. And of course, everybody, laughed and they all applauded and everything. And I mean, talk about a moment when Lee Cotman gives you a comment like that. But then I thought to myself, yeah, he heard me give the most perfect performance that I've ever given. What's the chance that that's going to happen to me again? But I'm going to give a perfect performance. I think I used up all my luck for my whole career. So that was what spurred me to learn how to sight call.
Gotcha.
I thought, I've got to be able to, if I screw up a card, I've got to be able to bail.
Yeah.
And that was where I started to teach myself. I taught myself to sight call at first before I sort of went to any schools. And then I went to a couple of schools later on to tune it up. But that was another influence. Lee was a big influence on my calling career, even though he was in New York and I'm in Toronto. We saw each other, well, several times a year, just at various dances and festivals. But he was always calling and I was always dancing. But again, he would, if I asked him a question, he was always really generous and gracious with his answers. And if he did happen to be in a room when I was calling, he was always right there in front of me. And I'm not the only caller that he was like that with. I mean, he really encouraged new callers and did his best to support you. So, I mean, hands off to Lee. He was, I was going to say one of a kind, but he wasn't the only one that was like that. There were lots of them that would, Mike Jacobs was another one. That, I don't know if you know.
I have not heard of him.
He died a few years ago,
Okay.
but he was just one of the top shelf challenge callers, and he also called a lot of the mainstream and plus festivals as well. But he was a big wheel in Collar Lab, and but he was another one that he was an outstanding coach, and I got a lot of free lessons from Mike because I came to his dances and he would answer questions. And in fact, one of my wife's favorite stories actually was we used to go to a weekend at it was called a weekend, but at Cherry Ridge, but it really went on for a week. So it was one of these things where you came in and they danced Friday night to Sunday at noon, and then Sunday night to Tuesday at noon, and then they took Wednesday off and started Wednesday night and went Wednesday night to Friday at noon, and then they went Friday night to Sunday at noon, and that was that whole thing. They called it a weekend, but it was actually 4 callers that went through all that. And so Mike was the one who called the weekend before the Wednesday layoff. And Tuesday night, they generally had a guest caller night for people like me that, were just starting up and, were hoping to get a shot at calling to a real crowd at some point. So it was kind of like whatever new upcoming callers wanted to take a shot at it could go to this dance and call it this dance. So this particular night, it was just me and one other guy. And so we both called the dance, full dance. We took tip for tip turns. And let's just say he wasn't the best caller in the world.
Okay.
He was one of these guys that, pictured himself a lot more favorably than what the actual performance was. And so at the end of the dance, Mike goes up to talk to him and starts talking to him about his microphone technique. And he had some sort of a mic that had a switch on it that could change the tonal qualities of the mic and whatnot. And he must have spent 15 minutes with this guy, suggesting how he could fiddle with the mic and make things better. And he needed things to be better. He had a really unfortunate kind of voice. So when that's all over, so we had a trailer down in the campground, and Mike comes to our trailer for a decompression beer. And so we're sitting around the trailer. And so I said to Mike, "So?" And he says, "So what?" I said, "Well, you talked to the other guy for 15, 20 minutes about his mic. So how did I do?" And he said, "Fine." What do you mean fine? 15 minutes with numbnuts down there and I get fine? And he says, choreography was good, the flow was good, the music was good, it was fine. And that's all I could get out of him. So the next day Mike takes off because he's got other dances to call in other places. And his girlfriend, Darla, stayed behind to dance for the rest of the weekend. So we spent a fair amount of time with Darla, and a fair amount of that time I spent whining at her that, he spends 15 minutes with numbnuts about this microphone, and, all I get is fine, all I get is fine. And so this would have been August, I guess. The following November, at that time, there was a big convention called the Canadian Challenge Convention, which we thought was the premier challenge convention of the time, despite the fact that there was a national advanced challenge convention in the US. But, we thought the Canadian one definitely outclassed it. And a lot of the callers did too. And I'd gotten a guest slot at this convention. So I get up and I do my guest slot, and I didn't really notice, but Mike was in the room at the back of the hall. And so as I'm walking through the hall after I get down off the stage, Mike grabs me by the arm and says, "Come here, sit down." They had like round tables at the back of the room.
Yeah.
And he sits me down, and I get a half-hour one-on-one tutorial with Mike over everything that he's seen me do on the stage. And I mean, that was priceless, absolutely priceless. Pam was really pissed off because Vic Cedar was doing his first session in C3B.
Oh, wow.
We wanted to go and do that, but I'm sorry, it was worth it to me to have Mike give me that kind of a tutorial.
That's great.
But that's the way a lot of these challenge callers were, and not just for people like me that they knew fairly well. They're truly generous with their time. And then I was still a challenge caller though. Like I mainly wrote my material and read it, even after I'd learned to sight call and got so that I felt comfortable with it. basically my formula was I would warm them up with sight calling, and then go to the cards, and then maybe close the dance out with a sight calling wind in your face tip. And that was kind of the template that I'd evolved, but I still mainly read stuff. And then in the late 90s, on the basis of a C3A weekend that I was doing at Cherry Ridge, so all by myself, a guy that was the booker for Times Squares, which is the gay club in New York, hired me to do their fly-in, which is called Peel the Pumpkin. Happens over Thanksgiving, or in October rather. Happens to be our Canadian Thanksgiving, but it's not your US Thanksgiving. And so fly-ins, I don't know if you're familiar with the IHSDC and the gay square dance community.
A little bit, yes.
A little bit. So they have these events called fly-ins. And that's because when their clubs first got started, and there were smallish groups, scattered around the country, when they wanted to have a big weekend, one of the clubs would set up this weekend, and people would literally fly in from all over the country to make a big dance weekend. And it got so a lot of clubs had annual fly-ins, and Times Squares was one of the famous ones, this Peel the Pumpkin thing. And at that point, I'd already started calling for the local gay club, Triangle Squares in Toronto. I'd done a few dances for them here and there. And I think I might even have done Chi-Town once or twice in Chicago. So I had an idea, kind of, what these things were, but I'd never been to a fly-in per se. But I knew they did all the levels. So I accepted this gig without really thinking about it, just being so pleased that somebody would ask me to do a weekend for Peel the Pumpkin. And then when I thought about it, it was like, oh crap, I just signed up to call mainstream and plus with singing calls, maybe even some advanced with singing calls. And they might have a little bit of C1 during the fly-in, but mostly mainstream and plus. And I'd be calling with other callers. And I was like, oh, what have I done to myself? So I thought, I've got to learn to be able to call mainstream and plus without having to read and without terrorizing the dancers, because the little bit of experience that I'd had calling mainstream and plus at that point, my stuff was always way too hard, because I had a challenge head, right? And I'm thinking about what weird position can I put them into? And, that was where my mind always went. And so I had to break myself of that. So I went to a caller school. So this was the precursor to the Northeast Caller School. In fact, maybe it was one of the first Northeast Caller Schools. I can't remember when Ken started calling it Northeast. Okay. But it was Ken Ritucci and Randy Page were the two main owners. And they'd basically taken it over from Al Brundage. And I don't know if Earl Johnson was still doing it then or not. But anyway, they had inherited from Al Brundage, and now they were running it together. So the staff was them, Johnny Preston, Randy Doherty, Mike Jacobs. So, I mean, hey,
that's a hell of a team right there. That's nice.
Yes. And, so at the beginning of a college school, you fill out this form, and they ask you, so what are you hoping to learn at this college school? And what I wrote, this is the word for word what I wrote, I want to learn to call mainstream and plus without terrorizing the dancers. That's what I told them. And so they took that as their challenge. Right? You're going to get challenge boy here to the point where he can call mainstream and plus without terrorizing the dancers. And so every time I came up with some challenge dumbness, they'd jack me up on it. And again, one of my favorite stories that I have told lots of times over the years was we were in class in the morning. Mike Jacobs was the instructor. And at some point, one of the other students said, how come you can't have the center square through 3 and then call touch a quarter? And several people said, oh, that's 2 right hands in a row. That doesn't feel good. And he says, well, what could you call then? Joe challenged here without even thinking, says, left touch a quarter. And Mike says, okay, Barry. So what do you have now after that left touch a quarter? And I said, well, I've got left hand waves with the boys looking out and the girls looking in. And he says, so now what are you going to do with a mainstream floor with left hand waves with the boys looking out and the girls looking in? And of course, I'm stumped. I have no idea what I could do with a mainstream floor that wouldn't tank them in some way. And he says, you think about that. So I spent the whole afternoon, the rest of the class went on doing whatever they were doing. I spent the whole afternoon mulling that over. What the hell could I do from that? It took hours of thought. And what I eventually came up with was, boys, you turn back. Left touch a quarter, boys, you turn back, bang. Instant normal waves or normal lines, normal couples, and it flows. I mean, the U-turn back would be in flow direction. It actually flows. And I was so proud of myself. But the real breakthrough there, and this is something I tell students when I'm the coach, I relate this story, which is why I've told it so many times. Because especially as challenge callers, we devalue these simple calls. Like that challenge, I never would call U-turn back as a feature of choreography. It's U-turn back is kind of an admission of, oh, I'm doing something here where I'm just trying to set something up and I haven't figured out a decent way to do it. I can't flow into it, so I'm going to do a U-turn back. And there's a number of calls that are kind of like that we think are just too simple that I'm going to use these at challenge. So they don't come into your head when you're designing choreography for mainstream and plus, and yet they can be really useful in not just in setting up a particular formation, but in creating a feeling of dance. And so we have to think about calls in a way that lets us give them their true value. How do you incorporate this call into the motion of the dance? And we tend to think about it when we're thinking about choreography, we tend to think about it too much in terms of, well, I move them here and I move them there and I create this and I create that and I change it into something else, as opposed to what does it feel like to go through those motions? And we really, as callers, need to be thinking about the motion before we think about what the calls are that create that motion. You think to yourself, this is what I want them to be doing. This is the movement I want them to have. What calls can I put together that create that flow and that motion? And I found that that's not the way every caller thinks about it. Especially as you start to teach other callers, train other callers. And I'm not saying that that's the only way to think about it. That's the way it works for me. And one of the things I've learned about coaching as I've gotten into it is that everybody's brain works a little differently.
Sure.
And there's no point in hammering on some particular method of doing something if it makes no sense to the person you're talking to. Some people will, see that formation, it'll just pop out at them, and other people, they could look all day and they'd never see it.
Yeah.
But they'll see something else, or their brain works in some other way. Like some callers have no trouble remembering a list of calls. So for them, a sequence is just a list of calls that they can remember. 10 calls in the list, I can remember that, no problem. I can't remember more than a couple or 3 calls that are, they give them to me on a piece of paper. It would take me a half an hour to memorize those 3 calls. But I can remember emotion. And I can remember a long traffic pattern. I can remember the traffic pattern for a singing call. That's 64 beats of music. And I can tell you what all the calls are that are the bits and pieces of that to create that motion. So that's the way my brain works, but that doesn't necessarily translate for everybody. So one of the challenges of coaching is to try and figure out a way to reach the person where they are.
Sure.
You know, how do they conceive of whatever it is you're trying to talk about?
That's good stuff right there, Mr. Clasper. I appreciate that. Based out of the choreography, you starting out in the C's and basically working back to mainstream plus and all that, so you could do other dances and all. Do you have a favorite call?
A favorite call? Huh. I'm not really good with questions about what's my favorite this or my favorite that. I can never think of anything when people ask me that. But in this case, one of the calls I really like is Tally Ho.
Tally Ho. Okay.
So if you don't dance C1, you wouldn't be familiar with it, because it's a C1 call written by Mr. Cotman, of course. And it is a really elegant call. And it's one of those calls that when you describe it, it sounds like it should be really little bits and pieces and feel awful to do. But once you understand the action, it flows really nicely, and it can be done from so many different places. Some guy sat down and counted them up, and I think he came up with 74 formations or something. You could Tally Ho in. But here's the rule for Tally Ho.
Okay.
You do half a circulate. The centers hinge and do half a box circulate while the outsides trade. Then two people are going to meet with an inside hand. They cast 3/4 and the others move up. So it ends kind of like a chain reaction, if you're familiar with that. That particular ending, the way chain reaction ends, it turns out there's bunches of calls that end that way. Motivate ends that way, and Relay to Top ends that way. And there's bunches of them that end with that particular action. But Tally Ho is, it just, to me, it's just such an elegant call. You can do it facing lines. You can do it from lines facing out. You can do it from weird T-bones, and it's just a cool call.
Okay.
But by and large, I mean, we all have quote favorite calls. There's calls that come into my head when I'm sight calling. So they're obviously the calls I prefer. When I'm sight calling, depends on what level I'm sight calling as to which calls are going to pop into my head. But we have these things in our head. Sight callers often claim that they're strictly sight callers, and I poo-poo that.
Sure.
I think anybody who's an accomplished sight caller has a bunch of modules in his head.
Yeah.
May not recognize that he has a bunch of modules in his head, but he does, because most sight callers have setups from which they can call, 5 or 6 calls, because they know exactly where they're going, and while they're thinking up the next thing that they're going to try and do. So we all have these flow modules in our head. We've got get-ins and get-outs, in our head. So all sight callers use modules, whether they'll admit to it or not. Sure. And sight callers read a lot too. They don't like to admit that either, but a lot of them work from notes in front of them, so that they remember, what their program is they may not have notes that have call for this sequence. Yeah. But they know I'm going to try and emphasize this, or here are the setups that I can call this from, and that kind of thing. I know a number of callers have showed me their get out books, where they've got a 3-ring binder or something that they carry around with them, and they open it to the page for an 8-chain get out, and they call themselves into the 8-chain setup with sight, and then they do the get out. Yep. So that's reading.
You've got me pegged on that. I've got probably 2 gigs of get outs on a memory stick. and
Yeah.
I'll pull them up. And I don't sit there and just go one after the other, but each tip or every other tip, I'll pick out one that I like from a corner box or from partner lines. And going in at some point, I'll do it, but
Yeah.
I can't remember all of those.
No.
So, I'll pick one out. Now I remembered, I'll look at it and I'm like, all right, I like that. And then I'll start calling and I'll get it to the corner box or wherever, and then I'll use it. So, but yeah, I constantly, and I was going to ask you before you brought it up. So I don't want you pulled me in on it. I ask everybody that I talk to on here, do you have a favorite get out? Because I absolutely write them down.
Not that I could. No, I don't have a favorite get
Okay.
out. I mean,
Okay.
I have ones that I like. One that I dreamt up recently, and again, it won't make sense if you don't dance C1. But from a C1 Phantom, two-face lines with everybody looking in, I called a Phantom Mini Busy to a right and left grand.
Okay.
And now that's a very specific setup that you got to have. It doesn't take long to set it up, though. Like I used it as a biggie. You know, does that familiar term to you, biggie?
No, sir, it is not.
Okay, that's what we call a short, snappy little sequence that you start a tip with.
Okay.
So the idea is to do something that's kind of like, oh wow, and it happens within 3 or 4 calls, so that you can, get the dancers amped up to whatever it is you're going to do. That particular one probably would not be the first thing you do in a dance, right? You'd be working them up to that. But when I use that, it's when I've been doing some phantom work with them, and maybe the previous tip I've been leaning on the phantoms quite a bit, and then the next tip I have that get out, that biggie to use on them.
Gotcha.
But I don't have. Well, another thing that I do a lot because other guys don't is I'll do things like flip galaxies to right and left grands.
Okay.
Or cut them to promenades and that kind of thing. But it's, probably like a lot of callers use Dixie Grands for get outs. And one of my favorite things, I get all kinds of mileage out of these, is I do Dixie Grands in the middle of sequences. So their stuff comes after the Dixie Grand.
Right. Okay.
And I started doing that because there's a club in California, which is one of the clubs I told you about that I used to call for at least once a year on the West Coast, called Trailblazers. And their format at the time was they had a dance weekend every month. They would bring callers in from all over. And their format was they wanted hard advanced with, something special worked, but not from another list. Like they didn't want you bringing stuff down off the challenge lists.
Right.
They wanted you to use advanced or below, but they wanted it to be challenging and workshopy stuff, and that's what they wanted. And the trouble is, every month they were doing this. So you'd have to research what the callers before you had done, so you didn't reuse it too quickly. And so it was a big job to do that. And I can't remember why I settled on this at the time, but I started thinking, well, what about doing Dixie Grands in the middle of sequences? What can you do with that? And it was sort of a thought experiment at first, because, well, what can you do with that? What have you got after a Dixie Grand? And there's your first hurdle. Most dancers don't know what they have after a Dixie Grand because it's always followed by element left.
Right.
And so they don't realize that Dixie Grand always turns into a circle. It's like right and left grand always turns into a circle as soon as it starts, regardless of where you do it from. So Dixie Grand, you're in a circle, you're looking around the rim of a circle. So if you're calling advanced, Obviously you can do a lot of all 8 stuff from there, because you can do all 8 swing throughs and things like that. So I started working out things that I could do after calling a Dixie Grand. And it turns out there's all kinds of neat stuff that you can do. And I started to become known. That was one of my signature things, was to call Dixie Grands in the middle of sequences, and then have some bizarre way to get out from there. And to the point where I now have a new call that I call Dixie Grand, It Ain't Over.
Dixie Grand,
I had to do an element left and go home. Mm-hmm. A lot of times they realize it can't be over after the Dixie Grand because they're nowhere near their corner. And they may be looking at same sex around the circle or something, which there's a good example. That's if you call Dixie Grand set up so that the one boy is going one way around and the other boy is going the opposite way around, so that they meet after the Dixie Grand, then you call a slide through.
Right. Gotcha.
So now the boys have got right hands with each other, the girls have got left hands with each other, because the girls were together too, obviously. And so now you've got sort of an Alamo ring set up, except that you've got a pair looking in and a pair looking out. So then you can do stuff with that, right? You can direct calls to the people looking in and the people looking out, but it's really disorienting, because the people that you muckled onto with the slide through are not the ones that you're looking in with, right? You got one boy looking in and one girl beside him looking in. But the last movement you made was with the hand that the person you got by the hand. That's the one you're thinking about. So now you got to switch gears, and so it's actually a fairly challenging thing to do. But that shows you what kind of mileage you can get out of calls that are often, we just throw them out there in very limited circumstances.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of usages that you can make of it. So that's one of my biggest mileage things now is, oh, you want a little workshop on something? Let's do this.
Very nice. Mr. Clasper, when we started this, or Barry, when we started this.
Yeah, you don't have to be so formal.
It's a habit of mine being in law enforcement. I call everybody Mr. or Mrs. And that's the way my dad always told me to do it.
Yeah, I always look for my father when people call me Mr.
Yeah, I understand. And like I told you, my brother's named Barry, and that's your middle name. We didn't even get into that. When we started this off, I told you that I use this, to get stories out about yourself, and we've got a few of those, and stuff for callers, advice-wise. And I mean, we've got so much. As soon as we get done with this, I'm going straight to not Square View, Nations, to look at Tally Ho. And of course, I don't dance it, and I don't call that level, but I just want to look at it. And then I'm going to probably dive into the Dixie Grand stuff, just because you said that. Mr. Clasper, I appreciate you doing this. I'd love to do some more. I think we've been going about an hour 20 now. And
oh yeah.
And so
it's almost time for wine here, so you don't want to intrude on that.
It's almost time for dinner here, so, and I'm about to intrude on that with my wife, so I got to get that going. But now, that being said, I would love to talk to you again, because like you were saying, we watch these. It's tough to get more than an hour in, depending on what you do. And so I would love to get more of your stuff out there. That's just phenomenal for callers, and the stories with Kip Garvey and Lee Kopman. I never had the chance to meet Lee. I've heard a lot about him. I talked to Steve. I did a podcast with Steve. Great guy. Kip Garvey, never had a chance to meet him until I did get to meet him at Caller Lab this past time. And I'd done a podcast.
In fact, that's the first time that I actually met him in the flesh, even though we'd seen him at this dance back in the late 70s. But I never actually introduced myself or talked to him or anything. And we passed a few emails back and forth, because we're both accredited caller coaches now. And so we were working on a project that involved each other. But that was my first time actually really meeting him and talking to him in a hallway kind of thing. He's quite a guy.
Yes, sir, he is. Well, now, will I have a chance to talk to you when we are you going to Nationals in June?
I am.
Fantastic.
Yeah, we're going to Milwaukee.
Okay.
And so I haven't gotten my schedule yet or anything, so I have no idea what I'm doing there. But yeah, we've got a busy summer that way because we're going to Milwaukee, and then from there, and we're driving to Milwaukee from Toronto, so that's about 11 hours, something like that. And then from Milwaukee, we're driving down to Durham, North Carolina, because the gay convention starts down there the following weekend, basically.
Okay.
So I'm one of the staff callers at that. And then we're driving home from that, and I think we're home for like a week and a half, and we're flying to the Canadian National in Calgary, which is the end of July.
Well, we're about the same distance, evidently, from Milwaukee, because I'm driving, and it's about 10 and a half hours for me from Atlanta. So
yeah,
you're
more to it's more like a due north kind of direction.
It's almost exactly due north. It is. Yeah, it's pretty close to due north.
Yeah, even though the Mercator projection maps exaggerate it, it really does sort of look like a pyramid on the map. And people don't realize that like places like Atlanta are actually due south of things in Canada that are sort of in the middle.
Yeah. Mr. Clasper, it's been a pleasure, sir. Thank you for doing this for me, Barry. And I'll see you in the Nationals. And hopefully we can sit down. We can find another hour and do another just talking about square dancing in your life, man. It's awesome. It's a pleasure meeting you.
You're easy to talk to, Charlie.
Oh, no. You make it easy, sir. Barry, I will talk to you soon, sir. I will see you in Nationals, and we'll figure out another time to do another hour of this. This is great. Thank you, sir.
Okay, Charlie. Thanks for asking me.
All right, Barry. You have a good night. Have some wine.
You too. I'm going to have some wine.
All right. Bye-bye.
Circle to the left, there's a light that glows by the front door. Don't forget that key's under the mat. Men start riding, rode it one time ago, rolling round. Alabama left and weave the ring. Go to church cause your mama says to. Visit grandpa each chance that you can. Let yourself feel the pride. Always stay humble and kind. Head square through in the middle and go to four, you know now. That corner lady there, you know, see go. Swing through the night, and now the boy run right. Half tag, scoot back and go. Boy run right, slide through in the corner, swing her. You take her by the hand and promenade round that ring. Let yourself feel the pride. Always stay humble and kind. Head square through the four, hands around the ring, you go down. That corner lady there, you don't see go. Swing through the night, now the boy run right. Half tag, scoot back and go. Boy run right, slide through in the corner, swing her. You take her by the hand and promenade round that ring. Let yourself feel the pride. Always stay humble and kind. Four ladies chain across that ring, you turn the girl now. You turn and chain that lady right back home. Join hands, circle left, go moving around. Alabama left and weave the ring. Go to church cause your mom says to. Visit grandpa each chance that you can. Let yourself feel the pride. Always stay humble and kind. Side square through in the middle and go. That corner lady there, you do with do. Swing through tonight, boy you run right. Half tag, scoot back and go, boy run right. Slide through in the corner, lady swing. You take her by the hand and promenade. Let yourself feel the pride. Always stay humble and kind. sight, square through in the middle of the ring, we're about to go now. Corner lady does she go, swing through the night, and now the boy run right. Half tag, scoot back and go. Boy run right, slide through in the corner lady swing. Take her by the hand and promenade. Let yourself feel the pride. Always stay humble and kind. Circle left, hold the door. Say please, say thank you. Don't steal, don't cheat, and don't lie. Men start right. One time tonight, left out a man we pray. Go to church cause your mama says to. Visit grandpa each chance that you can. Let yourself feel the pride.